Hi, my name's Chris Carter, instructor here at Point Blank. If you want to learn more about sound design, head over to our website at pointblanklondon.com. In this first of 3 videos looking at Native Instruments Massive, we're going to discuss the fact that the instrument is a subtractive synth, explain what that means, and look at the signal flow within the instrument. So what we have here, fairly typically for a subtractive synth, are 3 oscillators, oscillator 1, 2 and 3, 2 filters, filter number 1 and 2, our amplifier section here, and included in our output section we also have a couple of effects. And if we compare this oscillators, filters, amp to a simplified model of a subtractive synth, we'll see something very similar. Here is our simplified model, and in the same way that we have in Massive, oscillators, filters, amps. So what we have typically are oscillators, this is where the sound originates from, triggered at specific frequencies or pitches by a keyboard here. And the oscillators can contain a range of different waveforms, which we'll look at in more depth in a later video. The output of the oscillators is fed into this filter module here. The filters are typically what modifies the sound from being static and not very interesting to modifying the frequency spectrum and giving the sound some kind of character and shape. The output of our filter section is fed into the amplifier module, and the amplifier module is what drives the speaker. So this is our very simple signal flow from left to right. If you follow this grey line, oscillators into filters into amps, and if we go back to Massive we see the same kind of thing. Oscillators, output of the oscillators into the filters, output of the filters into the amps. If we go back to our model, you'll see that we have a secondary signal path here. Instead of the grey line from left to right, we also have this blue series of signals, and that's emanating from down here, something described as a modulator. And typically modulators will fall into one of 2 types, and they will either be envelopes or LFOs. And if we go back to Massive, where do we find our envelopes and LFOs? We find them here in our center section. In fact, we have 4 envelopes, which are in blue here, and we have 4 LFOs, which are in green. We also have 3 different kinds of LFOs, which can be selected via this drop-down menu. And as you can see, we have LFOs, we have performers and steppers. LFOs look like this, performers like this, and steppers like that. So when we go back to our simplified diagram, we can see that our modulators are pretty flexible in terms of what they can do. We can route these to oscillators, we can route them to filters, we can route them to amplifiers, and until we assign a modulator, typically it won't be doing anything. It will be inside the instrument waiting to be assigned a role or a purpose. So we could choose our modulator to modify the oscillators, in which case it might modify the wave shape, or it might change the frequency or pitch. Or we could send a modulator to a filter, and what we would usually be doing there is adjusting a filter cutoff to change the spectral content of the sound, or possibly adjusting the resonance of the filter and so on. Or we could be sending the signal from a modulator to an amplifier and controlling the loudness of the sound over time. And how would we, inside Massive, assign our modulators, envelopes and LFOs, to all of those destinations? If we go back to the instrument, we can see a number of boxes on the panel here, and all of these are mod destinations. So what that means is wherever we see this box, we can modulate that parameter. And what we'll do is assign a modulator to that parameter in order to be able to adjust it over time. When we first open the instrument, we have one single modulation assignment, and we'll find that up here on the amplifier section. So you can see that the amp is being controlled by envelope number 4. So that means if I trigger the envelope, One thing that you'll notice about the sound is that after the initial attack phase, we've got this kind of drop in volume, which you can see both up here on my spectrum analyzer, which is just the logic EQ with the analyzer turned on, and also down here in my oscilloscope, which I've loaded from Reactor. So you can see that drop off in intensity of the signal as I hold the note. And the reason for that is after the initial attack phase, which happens to be quite short, I have a decay to a level which is a little bit below that initial attack level. So if, for instance, I was to push the decay level up like this, then what we'll see now is that drop off will disappear, and instead we have a much more consistent level. If I was to bring the decay level all the way down to the bottom like this, then we see the sound decay away to silence quite quickly, and how long it takes to do that is dependent on this decay value. So for very short stabby or plucky sounds, I'll be using a short decay, and for something that is going to last a little bit longer, I'll be using a longer decay. So this is our only assignment when we first load the instrument up, and what I'm going to do is push the level back up like this. What we have now is something which we would typically describe as a gate, which means that as soon as I press a key, we have full amplitude. As soon as I release the key, the sound stops instantly, or something very close to instantly. So what would happen then if I wanted to perhaps control a filter cutoff over time using another envelope? I could do this to create some kind of pad or swell sound, or if I was using shorter envelopes with lower decay values, some kind of pluck or stab. So in order to do this, what I'm going to have to do is load a filter, because as we can see, when we first open the instrument up and we have the default settings in front of us, both of the filter banks have no filter setting loaded, in the same way that neither of the effects have anything loaded as well. The oscillators, their default setting here is square saw, and what we'll look at in a later video is how to change the setting of these oscillators, and also how to modify the wave shape over time. So what I'm going to do, first of all, a simple kind of stab sound or a swell or a pad. I'm going to select a filter, and I'm just going to go for filter low pass 2. And you see when I do that, I have a couple of parameters that come available, my filter cutoff and my filter resonance. And what I'm going to do here, because I have two filters, and because in this case I only want to listen to the output of filter number 1, I'm going to push this crossfader up like this. So mix 1, mix 2, this is a reference to the output of filter 1 and the output of filter 2. So if I was to push this all the way up, at the moment the sound is going to have disappeared completely. And the reason for that is my filter cutoff is all the way down at 0. If I was to gradually rotate this filter cutoff, and let's just zoom out a little bit so we can see what this is doing to our frequency spectrum. With the filter completely open, there are all the harmonics, there's the unmodified waveform, and as I bring the filter cutoff down, we can see that that's taking away the higher frequencies, the higher harmonics, the further round to the left we rotate that dial. So what I would like to do is to have one of my modifiers, be it an envelope or an LFO, to control this parameter for me. So let's try assigning an envelope first of all. And let's imagine that we're going to start with the filter cutoff down, and we want it to quickly open and close, something like that. So we're looking for a short envelope which is going to control the full range of my filter cutoff. And I'm going to assign envelope number 1 to that parameter, to the first of these 3 boxes. And I do that by clicking on my crosshairs. You can see I've picked up the blue number 1, and I'm going to click one more time in that box, and that has now been assigned. But I'm not going to hear anything. And the reason for that is I haven't yet defined the range of modulation, or what you could also describe as the mod depth, the modulation depth. So I do that by clicking and holding inside this box and dragging up until I've set the range that I'm looking for. In this case, I want to use the full range of the parameter, so I'm going to drag all the way up until this blue circle is all the way around the parameter. And let's zoom out again so we can see what's happening to the waveform and to the frequency spectrum. We can see a couple of things. Notice how the waveform becomes more rounded, and as it becomes more rounded, the sound becomes a little bit softer and we lose some of the high harmonics out of the sound. Let's go back to envelope 1. This is actually our default envelope shape, and we haven't changed this at all yet. So what would happen if I was to gradually increase the attack time? Now we can see the waveform beginning as a more rounded shape and gradually taking on the square saw shape that we saw originally. And the reason for this is, in this situation we have the filter gradually opening, and as that happens, the full frequency content of this waveform square saw is revealed. But that doesn't last for very long because we have a decay value here, and the decay value is dropping to this point there. So we have a sense of the filter first opening and then closing, not all the way down to the bottom, just to something like the midway point here. So what would happen if I was to bring my decay level all the way down? Then what we're going to have now is a sense of the filter opening and then closing all the way back down to the bottom. And as that happens, we can see the frequency content modified. How about then, instead of some kind of swell shape like this, we're looking for more of a pluck or a stab. In this case, I'm going to make the attack very short. I'm going to take it all the way off. And the decay time now is going to control the length of time it takes for the filter to close. So this is a relatively short sound. We could make it a little shorter or longer. Very simple. So how about if we wanted to assign an LFO instead? What I'm going to do first of all is bypass this first assignment by pressing Control and muting. I could also do that by pressing Alt on my keyboard and turning on and off, and if I double click you can see the assignment's gone altogether. Let's just put that back like that and bypass one more time. And what we're going to do now is take the LFO, LFO5, and assign it to the second of these slots. So let's drag that, click once, and again I need to click and drag up rather, to create the range. And you can see now LFO5 is controlling the full range of my filter cutoff. Let's click on LFO5 just to bring that window up, and what we can see is that LFO5, or whichever LFO we have selected, actually contains two waveform shapes, and these can be shifted backwards and forwards in time, and we can also select various different shapes either from here or from further drop down menus. I'm going to stay simply with my sine wave shape for now, and you'll also notice that we have a crossfade which enables us to switch between our two LFOs or our two LFO shapes. I'm going to keep this all the way at the top, so what we are going to be hearing is a sine wave. So what we would expect to hear now is the filter gradually opening and closing over time, and if I press a key, that's exactly what we hear. And if I zoom back out, we see the same kind of thing that was happening with the envelope, but instead of being a single trigger, a single one-shot event, An LFO is something which continues to repeat for as long as we hold the key down. You'll also notice inside the LFO section we have a rate here, and if I was to adjust this, what we're doing is controlling the speed with which the LFO is opening and closing the filter cutoff. If I wanted to have more than one LFO shape involved, let's say for instance I wanted to use, instead of a smoothly opening and closing sine wave, something like a ramp shape, what this means is we're going to hear the filter open instantly, close gradually, and when it reaches the bottom, open instantly again. And in order to hear that, I'm just going to drag my crossfade down, and let's speed that up. Often we'll want to synchronize something like this with the tempo of the project that we're working on, and in order to do that I'm going to click on sync, and what we have now is an LFO which is synchronized to the tempo of our project, whatever that is. In this case it happens to be 120, and these figures here, at the moment this represents 1 bar. Let's just change this to be 1/16, and if I was to play a note now, what we're hearing is the LFO triggered 16 times a bar, and if I was to change this to 1/8, 8 times a bar, etc. Let's go back up to the filter. Let's enhance this effect a little bit by turning the resonance up, and what this is going to do is introduce a kind of peak just around the filter cutoff, wherever that happens to be. And by turning up the resonance, the sound will take on a little sharper, more pronounced filtered character, and that's actually quite obvious if we just back that off a little bit. And what if we wanted to have both of these parameters happening at the same time? What I'm going to do now is Alt click. So we now have 2 modulation parameters assigned to the one destination, the filter cutoff. So what this means is I'm going to have a fairly quickly closing envelope, but whilst I hear this decay portion of the sound, I'm also going to have a kind of opening and closing effect caused by LFO number 1. And in fact, LFO 5 is opening the filter so much, I'm just going to reduce this down, something like that. So what we'll have now is envelope 1 opening the filter, we'll hear that closing, and as it decays away we'll also have the effect of LFO 5. Let's just turn LFO 5 up back to a 16. And there we go. So that's assigning 2 modulation sources to a single parameter, and what we're doing is subtractive synthesis because we're using the filter to modify the spectral content, the harmonics and frequencies that are present in the signal over time.